This is Chapter 18, Discussion Number 2, Conflicts of the Cold War. While the proliferation of nuclear weapons made the direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union practically unthinkable, the United States and the Soviet Union often had conflicts as through other countries, as sponsoring them, providing weapons, advice, and even sometimes sending troops. One of the first examples of this using other countries as proxy would be on the Isthmus of Korea. North Korea and South Korea were divided after World War II between the Soviet Union and the United States because Korea had been conquered by Japan. Now that Japan had been eliminated as a political threat, who was going to run Korea? In the same way that Europe was divided amongst the Soviet Union and the democratic countries, the same thing happened with Korea. North Korea going to the communists and South Korea going to the United States. The Korean conflict started when North Korea attacked South Korea. Now, the United Nations had said that they would protect them. However, in order to get the United Nations to show up, in order to protect South Korea, they needed the Security Council to approve it. One day, the Soviet Union got upset about something else that had happened in the United Nations, and they walked out. And just so happens on that day, the United States said, "Hey, we should go defend South Korea." And the United Nations voted yes. It's the only time that the United Nations had actually come out and said that they would enter into a conflict to defend a particular country. So, the United States and many of the allies of the United Nations sent military forces to Korea in order to defend South Korea from North Korea. After the South Koreans had almost been eliminated, they were able to fight their way back and had actually gotten everything back that had been taken from them by the North Koreans. And essentially, the Korean conflict has stopped with the line where the line started before North Korea had attacked. However, it is important to notice that Korea has not had a peace treaty ending the war that was in the 1950s. They have only promised to cease fire. And since that, it is the most militarized zone in the world, with mines and artillery and everything ready to go, because the war actually has not ended. But there are other places that have also had conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union or Chinese communism. Vietnam is one. North Vietnam invaded South Korea underneath the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. The French were there originally. It was their original colonial power. However, the French were unable to withstand the attacks of the North Vietnamese army with help from the Soviet Union. The French were pretty much eliminated from any influence in the area after losing a battle at Dien Bien Phu. However, the southern Vietnamese were not going to be left by themselves. The American policy of containment that had started with Harry S. Truman and had continued through the presidents after that started to help the South Vietnamese in order to defend themselves against the North Vietnamese. The United States had a policy of containment, which was based on the idea called the domino theory, that if the other countries saw that they were not going to be successfully defended and that it would be more beneficial to them to just surrender to communism, it felt that more and more countries would go to communism instead of standing up for what they believed to be right. One domino goes, they all go, was the general idea of the free world. And so the United States said that they were going to stop communism in Vietnam. They were there for over 10 years, and eventually the United States said that they were done fighting in Vietnam. They quickly South Vietnam lost to North Vietnam and is now one entire communist country. There's also in Cambodia, which happens to be a next door neighbor of Vietnam. The Khmer Rouge, underneath the leadership of a guy by the name of Pol Pot, established a communist dictatorship, killing over a population simply because they disagreed with his politics. However, they were even considered to be rogue, and so that the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia to stop the Khmer Rouge from killing everyone, and the Vietnamese then installed a government that the Vietnamese could get along with. We do have an event in the Cold War era where we have the closest opportunity of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev sent Soviet nuclear missiles to Cuba, which is 90 miles away from the United States. This would be a direct threat to the United States. And the United States then used its navy to blockade Cuba in protest, saying that anything going in and out of Cuba was going to be inspected by the United States to prohibit the stationing of nuclear missiles in Cuba. President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev together with nuclear war until the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics essentially surrendered and said that they would remove the missiles, and that is the closest that the world has gotten to nuclear war was the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, the idea that Cuba was under the control of Fidel Castro was not the best feeling for the United States at that time. So the United States was trying to find ways in order to remove Fidel Castro and the communist government of Cuba. They had this brilliant idea that Eisenhower had started, then Kennedy gave the final approval to train and spend an outfit with weapons, a bunch of Cuban exiles that they would try to go into Cuba and essentially declare war on Fidel Castro and oust him as being the leader. However, due to a lot of bad thinking and bad planning and bad luck, the Bay of Pigs invasion of exiles was an abject failure, and then Cuba continued to be a communist country. But Cuba wasn't the only one that really needs to be discussed during this idea of the United States versus the Soviet Union. Lots of Central American countries and African countries bribed to be part of the United States side or the Soviet side when it came to who their allegiances were. Most of these countries were being wooed in order to support the ultimate goals of perhaps raw materials, but also they were essentially trophies to say that the United States had more countries than the Soviet Union had more countries than the United States. While they did get raw materials from these countries, they really served little other purpose other than rebels trying to oust whatever government. The United States did continue its policies of free market and also the ideas of containment against the Soviet Union up through the 19th. This has been Chapter 18, The Cold War, Discussion 2, Conflicts of the Cold